So we'll be continuing to do scrimba and build our meme generator project inside of scrimba, and there are a lot of uh, conditional rendering lessons. I think everything is useful, so we should learn everything. So let's start with it.
value Boolean and field false. The idea is for it to be a piece of state that will decide whether or not the punchline should be shown in each of these jokes. And then I want you to add a, okay, well, this might look familiar. This is our joke component from the previous section. And we're going to use this to kick off a sort of mini series on learning about conditional rendering in React. Using and understanding conditional rendering is very important in React because you will see it everywhere in React code. To start us off, I have a challenge for you. You're going to create some state called isShown. Its value will be a Boolean, and you'll just default it to false. The idea is for it to be a piece of state that will decide whether or not the punchline should be shown in each of these jokes. And then I want you to add a button, probably just right here below the paragraph, that will toggle that isShown value back and forth. Pause it, syntax, and look at the code.
So I don't even know what to do. Uh-huh. So I guess const and is shown and set is shown is equals to react dot use state, and default is false, and add a button that toggles the value back and forth. Okay. Hmm. So this should be is shown and then we do this and make a button. Uh-huh. What? How do I create a button? And on click should be equal to a function, let's say change, or let's say handle click, and we can declare a function right here, right? And this function right here takes the new value, or it can take another function, and here we can say previous state, not of previous state. I think this should work. Let's save this note. Or oh, why is there nothing? Hmm. Hmm. Okay, let's set it to true maybe. Come on, please work.
So how this might work, have my state called isShown. Let's have it say show punchline.
Okay, so we made a mistake. This should be false without any quotes.
Then let's create a function that will help us toggle our value of isShown was. And let's add our on click event listener here to non-Congo show. While we're at it, I'll go ahead and console log current value is shown. And when I click show punchline, okay, now you'll notice that it said false, even though I'm flipping it. That's because it first console log is shown, which initialized as false, and then I called set is shown. If I click it again, I'll see the old value right before that changed. This console log is not terribly important anyway, so one of the reasons I use this joke component to help us learn conditional rendering is, well, I've used it already as a way to give you a sneak peek into conditional rendering. Since we have a template here already, even though this might seem a little backwards, I want you to make it so that our paragraph here only shows up if is shown is true. Again, you have a template to help you understand how that works, and then once you have that working, we'll if the is say if lines are gone. And if I click show punchline, awesome, our paragraph displays. Now, why on earth does this work? When you first learn JavaScript, we usually learn about how this and logical operator, the double ampersand, is used to make sure that both sides are true or truthy. So let's say you have a couple variables. We'll say condition 1, call it true, and condition 2, let's say that's also true. And if you have an if statement that says if condition 1 and condition 2, meaning if both of those are true or truthy, then the code inside this code will run. You also learned that if either one of these are falsy or false, so if I change either one to false, this code will not run. However, if you look through how the computer is actually running this code, it can be very like, for example, you change condition 2 to console log state. This is echo check.
So this is basically short circuiting so that if first statement is false, then the second one is not even executed to check if it's true or not.
Change behavior, not really specific result, but let me open the console, and I'm going to click save. We'll see that we immediately get the console log running of hello there. Now, let's see what happens if I change condition 1 to false. Save, and nothing gets console log. That's because what the computer does is it first checks the truthiness of this first statement, and if it is not truthy, if it's false or falsy, it actually completely skips whatever it sees after the double ampersand. Since it already knows that this condition will not satisfy what the damn is expecting, in other words, for both sides to be truthy, it knows already that it can completely skip whatever it sees here. So we use the advantage of this in React. Anytime we have an element on the screen that we want to display if something is true, or completely hide or unrender to page if that is false. Doing the setup, we realized that some jokes were just one-liners. They didn't have a setup and a punchline, they just wrote function. And in that case, we looked at our incoming crop shot setup and said, if that's falsy, then don't display this H3 at all. Similarly, with our local state that is shown, we can say, I only want to display or render this paragraph if is shown. By doing that, we can have a toggle button that when it's clicked will change is shown of this individual joke component to true, and therefore it will display a paragraph. More specifically, if it's a React will use only this component because its state has changed. Therefore, when it's running the return value again and determining what should actually be placed on the screen, is shown is now true, and therefore this expression gets run and put onto the page once. So as a recap, in React, when you have an element that you either want to display or not display at all, using the and logical operator is a really concise and great way to do that. This challenge is a pretty straightforward one. Based on what you just learned using the and logical operator, make it so that this h1 will only display if our array of messages is not empty. If this array is empty, then this h1 should not display at all, and we should end up with a blank page. While you're at it, go ahead and fix our little underline for the number of unread messages we have in our array. Pause the screencast and work on this challenge. End up with this challenge is a pretty straightforward one. Based on
If there are unread messages, hmm.
you just learned using the and logical operator, make it so that this h1 will only display if our array of messages is not empty. If this array is empty, then this h1 should not display at all, and we should end up with a blank page. While you're at it, go ahead and fix our little underline for the number of unread messages we have in our array. Pause the screencast and work on this challenge.
Okay, so I can state that messages. Oh wait. Hmm. What does this even mean? Isn't it just messages?
Well, first, let's say something like it's a pretty great sentence to say messages that link. Okay, that's a good start. Now, if we're deciding whether we want to display this at all or not, then we can use the logical and operator to say messages dot length greater than 0 and just
Okay.
that way, if messages dot length greater than 0 is a false statement, in other words, if messages dot length is equal to 0, then this h1 will simply not render at all. A more concise way would be to just say messages dot length and this h1, and that's because the number 0 is considered a false statement. However, I think it reads a little better to be explicit and say the greater than 0. Sometimes if this line gets a little bit long, you can break it down onto its own line, something like this. And we can test this by emptying our initial state array. And there we go, we have nothing on screen. Awesome work. Next, we're going to see another method for doing conditional rendering. We have a funny UI bug right now. When we click show punchline, it shows the punchline, but the button still says show punchline. Knowing what you know so far using the and operator to conditionally render something, I want you to think for a second, how might you change it so that it says hide punchline instead of show punchline when punchline is shown?
So exactly we can use the ternary operator, and if we can just do this, man. I don't even want to try. This is
if
just
is shown is true, then I want this to say hi punchline. And if is shown is false or is not is shown, then this. And we can do so by using the ternary operator. Ternary is really helpful when you want to display one thing based on condition. However, we can do better than this, and we can do so by using the ternary operator. Ternary is really helpful when you want to display one thing based on a condition or another thing if that condition is false. So instead of duplicating our button, I can keep my button here and simply change the word from show to hide using a ternary. Let me show you what that looks like. I'm going to delete the word show, put in a set of curly braces because I want to use JavaScript.
oh,
And we're going to use a ternary looking at the Boolean value is shown. And I'll say is shown question mark. Now if is shown is true,
okay. It would be placed right here.
then I want the string hide to be displayed as it changes it to hide punchline. As far as conditional rendering goes, probably 95% of the time you will see conditional rendering handled with either the double ampersand or a ternary. Again, the double ampersand is great if you either want something to display or not display, and the ternary is great if you want to choose between one of two things to display. If your conditions are more complex than just having one of two options to display, usually it will be best just to turn to a regular old if statement as we have seen in the past. You save a variable for your text and do either a switch statement or a series of if, else statements to determine what that variable should be and then just display your returned value. Since we've already seen what that looks like in the past, I'm not going to take that right now. I mostly just wanted to look at these two methods more conditionally rendering something. Now that we've learned that, let's get the quick methods. Let's do some conditional rendering practice. One thing I've done with our messages app is I changed this to just say messages instead of num messages because that just makes more sense because this is an array of messages, not a number. I've done with our messages app is I changed this to just say messages instead of num messages because well, that just makes more sense because this is an array of messages, not a number of messages. Anyway, your challenge is to display the correct thing on the page. If there are no unread messages, it should display you're all caught up. And if there are any messages in the array, it should display you have n unread messages, where n
Where n is the number of length. Okay, it's pretty easy, I think. Um, huh. If this is true, then you have to say what. Oh, now we can actually use the length also. Can't we use it without curly braces? Can we? Oh, huh. Not running. Curly braces? What do you want? JavaScript. What do you want from me? Okay, let's see.
represents the length of the array or the number of messages in that array. Put the word message aside for the text of messages dot length in case there is exactly zero message. It says you has dot length. And well, let's see where we are right now. Hit save. We have two unread messages. If I
Okay, so we have to wrap it around in each one. What did that do, by the way? Even if I remove this right now, will it make a difference? Why would it make a difference? Ah, okay.
remove the items from the array, you're all caught up. Awesome. At this point, it might be tempting to do some kind of nested ternary here that says if messages dot
Yeah,
length
exactly, exactly.
is exactly equal to one and put another ternary as the else of this first ternary. Personally, I think this is nearly impossible to reason about, and so I never do nested ternaries myself. I suppose one thing I could do is just render this s if messages.length is greater than one. I think that would look something like this. I would put message and then a set of curly braces and put in my JavaScript here that says messages.length is greater than one and the string s. Let's just see if that works. Personally, I don't love this solution. I'll add in a couple items here. Okay, we have two unread messages, and if there's only one item, okay, you have one unread message. However, when I look at this, it's not quite as clear as what I think I would prefer to do, and that is to type out the whole word message or messages and use a ternary. Let me show you what that would look like. You have blank unread, and then I will open up some JavaScript here, say is messages.length greater than 1, if so, I want it to say messages, but otherwise I just want it to say message. I'm going to put this onto its own line just so we have some extra space. And although this does take up more characters, I think, than what I had before, to me this is a lot easier if I have a fellow developer who's going to be onto this project and needs to understand what I'm doing here. I think this is easier to reason about and understand. As you can see, there are multiple ways to use conditional rendering, and this is the kind of thing that I'm talking about when we say that React is just JavaScript. Just like in JavaScript where there's multiple ways to solve a single problem, it's the exact same in React. Because you're just using JavaScript like ternary and logical and operator and so forth, you can solve the same problem in several different ways. Most people will tell you if you're just using JavaScript, like ternaries and the logical and operator and so forth, you truly could solve this in probably dozens of different ways. Most people will tell you to find a way that is easy to think about in the future and then to stay consistent throughout your entire code base. Let's go ahead and
Nice.
test this before we call it a good solution. And yeah, see, I have space there, so there's like extra space in there. Oh, and I guess breaking this onto its own line might not have worked. So let's just leave it. Okay, one unread message and two unread messages. Awesome work. When you're ready, let's keep moving forward.
What would we do if we wanted to have a space but also a soft wrap? Then what do we do? Huh.
It's that time again for another quiz. I'll just determine whether let's display one thing before we get to the operator. The AND operator is great to use if you want to decide whether or not to display operator. Because the display operator is technically to choose between certain numbers. There's one slight difference between the AND if ternary and what you can use with an if else block, and that is the switch statement UI for ternaries can happen right here in line. So I can have something and some JSX, or I can use a ternary that has the condition and the ternary and then the else inside of the ternary, which is some other. But if I need to use an if, else if, and else, or a switch statement, I can't do my if inside of the JSX directly like this. But if I need to use an if, else if, and else, or a switch statement, I can't do my if inside of the JSX directly like this. Instead, I need to go up above and set a variable, and then use my if and else if and else block to set some variable to some kind of JSX. I won't type out the whole thing, but that allows me to then just inside of here display some variable because previously in my if statement it was determined which JSX element it should be. Great work on this quiz. We still have a lot left to learn in this section, so let's keep moving forward.
Why can't we do if else inside of them? I don't know. Huh.
We're going to spend a fair amount of time talking about how to manage and deal with forms in React. From the outside, this might seem like
Let me see. Okay.
a kind of strange segue for us to be taking. However, I have found that forms are one of the most difficult things to understand, and truthfully, one of the most difficult things to use in React. If someone were to ask me what I think is one of React's greatest weaknesses, I would probably say forms. Fortunately, there is a plethora of really awesome form libraries out there that, in my experience, many people end up turning to in order to manage forms and not have to build everything that we're about to see and learn about from scratch. However, that being said, it is really important to know how to do this because, especially when you're dealing with a very small form like what we're about to see in the meme generator, it's not that difficult, and once you get enough practice under your belt, it's pretty straightforward. So why are we talking about forms in the first place? Well, in the old days, you would create a form in your HTML and you would give it an action, which had the URL, usually of some kind of PHP file that would, well, in the old days, meme generator, it's not that difficult, and once you get enough practice under your belt, it's pretty straightforward. So why are we talking about forms in the first place? Well, in the old days, you would create a form in your HTML and you would give it an action, which had the URL, usually of some kind of PHP file that would process your form. You would give it a method, usually of posts, and then when your form was submitted through some sort of submit button, your PHP would pick everything up from there and process the data from the form. Fast forward a little bit to slightly more advanced JavaScript, but still vanilla JavaScript, and you would likely see something that looked kind of like this. This selector goes and gets the form, it adds a submit event listener, and the function that runs whenever the form is submitted would simply gather all the values together and then submit it to an API somehow. Of course, my function is just console logging stuff. If I were to type in first name and last name here, let's go Joe Schmo, and it's just console logging for data. The main takeaway here, though, is to know that when you're submitting the form, it would gather all the data immediately at the very end of the process and then submit the data. The main takeaway here, though, is to know that when you're submitting the form, it would gather all the data immediately at the very end of the process and then submit it immediately after gathering it. So how is this different from React? The main difference in React is that instead of waiting until the very end of the process and filling out the form, when the form is submitted and then gathering the data, instead what we do is we create state, and every keystroke change or checkbox change or radio button change or whatever it might be, we update state, and therefore we are watching these inputs every keystroke or every change that's made to our form. Then when the time to submit comes, there's no more work really to be done. We already have gathered the data, and we simply submit that to our API and pass in the state that we have been tracking all along. Coming up, we are going to jump into the specific syntax of how to do this. However, I really think it would be a good idea to sort of pregame for these lessons by reading through the React documentation on forms. I know forms can seem like a rather mundane topic, but I promise this documentation from React is really excellent. They've done a great job explaining it. Think of this like reading the textbook before coming to class. Once you've had a chance to at least skim through the documentation and gain some level of understanding on forms in React, you'll be ready to move on to these next lessons where we start learning about how to deal with forms in React.
Hmm. I don't know. I don't wanna.
Let's see how we can manage these forms in React. And we're going to start very simple with a single input. I'm keeping this as simple as possible so not to distract us from anything but learning forms. As a reminder, in vanilla JavaScript, we would have a submit button, and when we click that submit button, it would run a function, gather all the data at that time, and then submit it to an API or wherever. What we'll be doing in React instead is maintaining up-to-date state for every change that happens in any input in our submitted to an API. As a reminder, in vanilla JavaScript, we would have a submit button, and when we click that submit button, it would run a function, gather all the data at that time, and then submit it to an API or wherever. What we'll be doing in React instead is maintaining up-to-date state for every change that happens in any input in our form. To accomplish this, there's a few things we need to do. First of all, we need some state to hold the current data that's typed into our input. Just like we've been learning, I can say first name input box begin. And now what I is listen for any to this input. Can you think what event listener I might need to add to my input to accomplish this?
On change.
Call it handle change, which I obviously haven't declared yet. So let's declare that function. And for now, let's just console log changed. Hit refresh, and now we can see every keystroke that I make is running our function. Now, one thing we haven't spent much time talking about is this parameter that I can actually receive as a part of my event listener function. In this case, I don't get to decide what actually gets passed to my handle change event listener function. Instead, what will get passed to it by the browser is an event object. This event object is really large. It has a lot of information in it. And if I console log event in scrimba, it's simply going to put synthetic base event. So at this point, I'd recommend you actually open your developer tools in the browser and see exactly what got logged to the console. You'll be able to dig into all of the properties of this event object. However, there's one property in this event object that I care the most about, and that is one called target. If I log event.target, will see that it gives me what Scrimba shows is the HTML element that triggered this event. Now, it looks like HTML in the console down here, but in reality, it's just the DOM object that triggered this event. That DOM object has properties that we care a lot about. For example, the value property. Let me hit refresh, and I'll just start with the properties of this event object. However, there's one property in this event object that I care the most about, and that is one called target. If I log event.target, we'll see that it gives me what Scrimba shows is the HTML element that triggered this event. Now, it looks like HTML in the console down here, but in reality, it's just the DOM object that triggered this event. That DOM object has properties that we care a lot about. For example, the value property. Let me hit refresh, and I'll just start typing letters, and you can see in the console, we're logging the current value on every keystroke of that specific input box. So let me set up a quick challenge for you. Your challenge is to update the first name state on every keystroke. I've set everything else up for you. You should be able to complete this challenge fairly quickly. I've added this console log here. What this will do is every time
Done.
the first name state changes thing up correctly in our handle change function, this I don't really care what the info refresh shutting out. This isn't that, and we'll do that determine what the state value being with every keystroke. And there we have it. As you can see, at least starting out, this isn't that terribly complicated. However, I am about to throw some wrenches in here. We're going to see that the complexity level will rise a little bit. However, before I do that, I want to get your hands on the keyboard, and we'll do that as part of the challenge.
Okay. Huh.
In this challenge, we want to add a last name input to our form. As I've done before, I'm being a bit intentionally vague here, and that's so that I can get you to think of all the steps that you would need to run through in order to get this to work. So do your very best in this challenge, and when you feel like you've got a good solution, you can hit play, and I will show you how I would do it. Pause now and work on the challenge.
So I think it's easy. Uh, just copy this. And handle change, handle last name change, and then yeah, I'm gonna make this.
In our code. In other words, we were repeating ourselves quite a bit. For example, I could duplicate this line, and I will change first name to last name. We'll say set last name. I then could duplicate my input, and we'll change this to
Yeah, we can actually do that smartly by reusing the handle change event, maybe. I don't know.
last name. Now, of course, there's a problem with using the handle change function on change, and that is because, well, handle change is only changing the first name. So maybe we make a change that says handle first name change. This is not going to be the ideal solution there. And then we'll duplicate this
Of course, this is not ideal, but
function and handle last name change. You can probably see where I'm going with this and how this is not going to be the ideal solution. And then last of all, we need to change this last name. Go ahead, save, especially when you think of some of maybe the crazy forms that you filled out before that have, hey, of course, this seems to be working, but we can clearly see this is not ideal, especially when you think of some of maybe the crazy forms that you filled out before that have, let's say, 20 or maybe even upwards of 50 input boxes. It's not going to work great for me to have a separate change function for each one of those and a separate piece of state for each one of those. So next what we'll do is we'll learn how to combine our state into an object and how to use the event parameter that we're receiving in our event handlers to determine which property of that state into an object, and how to use the event parameter that we're receiving in our event handlers to determine which property of that state object we should be updating. So when you feel confident with everything that we worked on here, let's jump into that next. Let's see how we can improve our form and how we're managing state so that when the time comes to add, let's say 20 or 30 more inputs, we don't end up drowning in duplicated code. Now, if you do just have 2 or 3, maybe even 4 pieces of data in your form that you care about, doing something like this might be okay, or at least manageable. Once you get to 4 or beyond, however, it starts to make a lot more sense to save your state in an object instead of in separate variables. The benefit of doing that is we'll receive one setter function, which we're going to learn how to use to update the correct piece of state in the object. Let's just dive into the syntax to make more sense of this. I'm going to remove this extra function here. Let's change this back to handle change so we can figure out to choose to save an object as our default, and an object will have a change first name to something more generic like this. If you remember back when we talked about the event that we're receiving in our handle change event listener function, if you did spend some time in your developer tools poking around that object and looking at its properties, you probably saw event.target, which we talked about in that previous lesson. Now in Scrimba, if I console log this event.target, it gets a bit truncated to look like an HTML element. However, under the hood, it's really a DOM object that we can access properties on. In fact, we saw how I can look at the value property to get the specific value that was typed into the input box. However, at this point, because an object is what we're saving in state, I can't simply say set form data to event.target.value because that would erase my object and replace it with just a simple string. And because I'm using the same handle change function on both of my inputs, I need a way to step into the input box. However, at this point, because an object is what we're saving in state, I can't simply say set form data to event.target.value because that would erase my object and replace it with just a simple string. And because I'm using the same handle change function on both of my
so in JavaScript you can replace an object with a string. Basically, reassign a variable a string when previously it was an object. Amazing.
inputs, I need a way for the handle change event to distinguish between which input it was that triggered that event. Well, it turns out that a good practice that we're neglecting to do right now is to give each of our inputs a name property. This is true of regular HTML forms in any case, but in React it's going to play a special role for us. What I can do is make the name property match exactly the property name in the state that we're saving. In fact, a good idea is to just copy and paste it so that you don't misspell it. And now I have access to event.target.name. Let's hit save. I'll trigger the event to happen in the first name property, and you can see it logs the first name property there. If I do it in the last name, it logs last name. Well, this is a great start. We have access to the property of state that we want to change, and we still have access to event.target.value, which is the value that we want to change it to. So now we have everything we need to call set form data and update our object correctly. Let's go ahead and call set form data. Before, when we were simply updating a string, we didn't care about what the previous version of that string was because we were just going to overwrite it with whatever was in the input box. This time around, however, we need to maintain instead of just and open up the body of that function. Mention here, I'll use a new object, and I want to make sure I keep all of the old object in this handle change event listener. Well, on your first attempt, the inclination might be to overwrite the specific property that we are trying to overwrite or that we're trying to update in this handle change event listener. Event.target.value, as the value is to surround my key here in square brackets. Once with ES6, there was a feature introduced event.target.the inclination might be to try something like let's use event.xerror. However, with ES6, there was a feature introduced called computed.
Why do we have to introduce this idiotic feature?
Your first attempt, the inclination might be to try something like let's use event.target.name as the key and event.target.value as the value. Of course, as we can see in the editor, this is a syntax error. However, with ES6, there was a feature introduced called computed properties. And what this allows me to do is to surround my key here in square brackets. Long story short, it makes it so I can turn a dynamic string, like something saved in a variable, and use it as the property name for my object. If that doesn't
Okay.
make a whole lot of sense, don't worry too much. Just know that you can fix the syntax problem by having dots here by surrounding it in square brackets. That's an overly simplified way to describe it, but don't worry too much about that. That's not the important part of this lesson. Let me add back my console log
This is an important part. Why is he saying that?
so we can look at our state every time it changes. Save, you can see in the console that it's empty to start with, and as I change the first name, my object is updating correctly. My last name is also still a part of my state. As I update the last name, awesome. This is great news that my entire state is staying intact. Honestly, what we just learned in this lesson might be one of the most difficult parts of understanding forms in React. So for those of you that were able to follow along, awesome, good job. For those that were struggling still, that's completely okay and completely normal. Don't be afraid to go back, rewatch this a few times, and because of that, in the next screencast, we're going to practice this a little bit more.
Just like the day I
Let's see how we can improve our form and how. Hopefully in this challenge you'll get a chance to see why it's beneficial to structure things the way that we just learned how to do. Your challenge is to add an email field and associated saves to our form. Pause the screencast and work on this challenge.
Oh, nice. Learned a new thing. That an object you can only say this. Okay. Think this should work? I want to What is Amruta? Why is it saying Amruta? Where is the validation check, bro? Where is the submit button?
Previously, when we were saving all of our state as strings, anytime we wanted to add new state, we needed to create new variables and new event handler functions. Now, however, we simply need to add a field to our state object, anything about my handle, an email property that starts as an empty string. And as long as with my input I give it the correct name, change the type to email, change anything about my handle placeholder, note it should do the trick. I'll hit save, as you would expect, now maintaining all three of these properties. Now, for those of you that followed my directions a few screencasts ago and actually read through the React Forms documentation, you would have come across a section that talks about controlled inputs. As of right now, our inputs are not controlled, and so in the next screencast, we're going to see one simple addition we can make to turn them into controlled inputs. For you that followed my and sure enough, our state is.
Okay. So he's definitely trolling us in some way. And okay. So today I'm learning forms, right? So forms.mdis. First thing is use uh, for dynamic change an object. Second thing we learned was I'm going backwards. I don't know, a lot of things have been learned. So event dot target is a term object and I don't know what else. On change maybe or this dot dot or something like this. Let's see controlled and we saw conditional rendering, right? Let's see now.
Is updating exactly as we would expect, now maintaining all three of these properties. Now, for those of you that followed my directions a few screencasts ago and actually read through the React Forms documentation, you would have come across a section that talks about controlled inputs. As of right now, our inputs are not controlled, and so in the next screencast, we're going to see one simple addition we can make to turn them into controlled inputs, and we'll talk briefly about what a controlled input is in the first place.
Yeah, what is a controlled input? Is this validation checks?
The term you might hear floated around as you're learning about React is something called controlled component. Again, if you read through the React Forms documentation, you'll come across the section called controlled component. If it's been a minute or you didn't have a chance to read through that, you can click this slide in order to go directly to that documentation. But when we are talking about maintaining state inside of a component, there's a common concept called the single source of truth. The idea is that, that documentation. But when we are talking about maintaining state inside of a component, there's a common concept called the single source of truth. The idea is that the state that you're maintaining in your component should be the single source of truth. If you think back to when we were learning about changing state and we had our boxes or squares example, one solution we came up with was allowing each box to take the incoming on prop and then set its own internal state based on that incoming prop. Then the box itself could change its own internal state and therefore display either being filled in or not filled in. It's been a minute since you've seen that lesson. Of course, you can always go back and watch that to refresh on what I'm talking about here. The problem, as we learned then, is that we have two instances of that state that exist, and they don't necessarily match up. In other words, there isn't a single source of truth. The array of these objects was being held in state in the app component. However, each box was then changing that state, essentially without telling the app component that it was changing, and therefore there was state that oftentimes would not match with one another. We have a similar concept happening here, where in the markup, inside of our inputs, each of these inputs, in effect, is holding its own state. Think how in a regular HTML form, no React involved at all, when a user types into an input box, essentially that input box is maintaining its own state. Well, in this case, we have two pieces of state. One is being held by the input box just in regular HTML, and the other is updating on every keystroke held in our React code. Of course, we have set it up so that the state of our input box then perfectly gets mirrored by our state in React. However, a good practice in React is to make it so that your React state is what drives the state that's visible inside the input box. I totally understand this might seem like I'm splitting hairs here, but if it helps, all this really boils down to is simply adding a value property to each one of our inputs. So here at the bottom of each one, I'll add value equals, and then a set of curly braces, and then all we need to do is add the piece of state, in other words, form data dot, and then the name of that specific input into that value. So we'll add form data dot, then the first one, we're going to have first name, last name, and email. Visually, we're not going to see any difference here. Conceptually, however, when I type into the first name, Bob, the value of this input box is no longer being controlled by the input, but rather by React. Every change that I make,
But what we are inputting to keyboard is actually not being entered by you. It is actually first you entered it, it cleared it, and then it took the value from the state. Okay.
runs my handle change function, which then updates the correct piece of state, which re-renders my form, and it sets the value of
So many re-rendering, bro.
my form input to be whatever state is. So now state is in the driver's seat, telling the input box what to display, rather than the input box telling the state what to be. The main reason to learn this about controlled components is because sometimes if you don't set this up correctly, React might sometimes complain about having uncontrolled components. Fortunately, the concept itself is more difficult to understand than actually implementing it. So if you don't feel like diving deep into understanding controlled components, honestly, that's going to be completely okay at this point. Just remember that you need to set the value of your inputs to be equal to your state that represents that input value. There are a few more small things that we need to learn regarding forms. So at this point, we're going to speed through some of those so that we can get to a challenge that will help you practice all of this together.
Amazing. This project is actually everything we need.
If only all form elements were as simple and designed the same way as the inputs that we've been working through, these text-based inputs, then our life would be so much easier. However, forms have only all form elements were as simple and designed the same way as the inputs that we've been working through, these text-based inputs, then our life would be so much easier. However, forms have more variety in the types of inputs you can have. For example, radio buttons and checkboxes, text areas, and so forth. Each one of these has some special
I mean, checkboxes. Each checkbox will have a state.
considerations we need to keep in mind when we're using them in React. To start us off, let's look at the text area element. In regular HTML, text area is a little different than an input because it is not self-closing. It has its own separate closing tag. And in HTML, whatever you put inside the opening include because to them in React. To start us off, let's look at the text area element. In regular HTML, text area is a little different than an input because it is not self-closing. It has its own separate closing tag. And in HTML, whatever you put inside the opening and closing tags is the value of that text area. You see, I hit refresh, and we get a text area that's a little bit larger. We can also set the size with rows and columns. The user can make this bigger or smaller if they need to. However, what the React team has done is they've chosen to make the text area much more similar to a text-based input. So they've taken the closing tag away, they've made it a self-closing element, and just like our inputs, we will now add a value property to it, and that's going to be the value that's inside of the text area. Once you understand that they've changed the text area to be a self-closing element, essentially everything else we've learned about text-based inputs remains the same. I suppose in the text area case, we're probably not going to include a type because the text area is sort of its own type already, but everything else should essentially be the same as our inputs, which means that it's time for a challenge. Okay, your challenge is to add a text area for comments to the form. We do want to include these comments in our state as the user is typing into the text area itself, so make sure to update our state as well. Pause the screencast, work on this challenge.
So I'm just gonna add comments, right? And then I'll just add a text area. Amazing. Isn't it amazing? I love it. And there is an on change, right? Wait a second. Hmm. Now we'll have to give it a property of name, I guess. Will it work? It's a different HTML element though, like a text area. It's not input. Will it work? Will it work? I guess it should work. Let's see. Okay, we need to console log it, maybe. Uh, so we need to console log what? Hmm. From data. Oh no, it's actually behind by one. Why is that? Huh? Weird. Why is it actually printing out wrong things? Okay, we can actually do it somewhere else. Actually, uh, no, we can't do anything anywhere else, right? Okay, so maybe it's because this function will return, but before it will display, and then it will return, right? I guess, I guess. So I think, yeah, I don't know.
While we're up here with our state, I'm going to add a comments property. And just make sure we assign the same name that we have in state. So comments and add text area. I've added some styling in order for handle change to work. Just since we will, as an input, let's just say aim name. That area isn't going to be styled that way. Maybe I later. But like you just add text area directly to my sure that it's hooked up correctly to state. And my text area isn't going to be styled that way. Maybe I can get lucky and
How
just
did he
add text area
give it
directly to my styles
an
field.
height?
Hit refresh. And okay, well, my height's a little funny, but that's something I could always change later. Let me add a console log here so I can make sure that it's hooked up correctly to state. Maybe we'll just log form data.comments to make sure that
Okay, he's logging form data inside of the component and not after the function. Okay.
that one piece is coming in. Okay, awesome. Now, I guess those styles aren't really going to work out because it's doing that text indent thing. That's kind of silly. Let's just put this in its own thing. Okay, that's a little better. Awesome job. The next form element we'll talk about is checkboxes. If
Wait,
only all form elements were as simple and designed the same way as the
wait a second, wait a second. What was that CSS, bro? So text indent would change this, but then what happens to this? So this is indented, but you don't want this to be indented. Why? Okay. Huh. Height is 30 pixels. Text intent text 10 pixels. I margin bottom. Hmm. Okay. I guess we'll move to the next section. Okay, next section, bro.
Be going to work out because it's doing that text indent. That's a little better. See something. Okay, that's a little better. Awesome job. The next form element see something.
Wait a second. Amazing.
Okay, that's a little better. Awesome job. The next form element we'll talk about is checkboxes. Let's take a look at the checkbox element. Now, checkboxes aren't just an HTML element on their own called checkbox, although to be completely honest, I kind of wish they were because that would just be a lot. Let's take a look at the checkbox element. Now, checkboxes aren't just an HTML element on their own called checkbox, although to be completely honest, I kind of wish they were because that would just be a lot. Let's look at the checkbox element. Now, checkboxes aren't just an HTML element on their own called checkbox, although to be completely honest, I kind of wish they were because that would just be a lot easier. But no, they are an input with a type of checkbox. Checkboxes are fundamentally different than what we have been working with so far with our text inputs because they just hold Boolean values. In other words, there's not going to be some kind of string text of my checkbox. Instead, there is a checked property that will either be true or false based on whether the user has checked it.
I really want to know that if we create a
Now,
checkbox.
checkboxes aren't just an HTML element on their own called checkbox, although to be completely honest, I kind of wish they were because that would just be a lot easier. But no,
Okay.
they are an input with a type. In other words, there's not going to, before we jump into check, let me clean up my instead. There is a checked property that will either be true or false based on whether the user has checked the box or not. Before we jump into check, let me clean up my input for just a second because right now I just have a bare box in here. While I was cleaning up this checkbox, I was reminded of something that we haven't yet talked about, and that is this HTML4 property because right now I just have a bare box in here. While I was cleaning up this checkbox, I was reminded of something that we haven't yet talked about, and that is this HTML4 property. When we have something like a label that is supposed to be tied to another input, you have a couple options. You could nest the input directly inside of the children of the label. What that does is if the label gets clicked, it will automatically input. You have a couple options. You could nest the input directly inside of the children of the
Is the input inside the children of the label.
label. What that does is if the label gets clicked, it will automatically propagate that click down to the input. However, my personal preference is to keep the label as its own separate element and then point that label using clicked if tied to another input. You have a couple options. You could nest the input directly inside of the children of the label.
Okay.
What that does is if the label gets clicked, it will automatically propagate that click down to the input. However, my personal preference is to keep the label as its own separate element and then point that label using HTML4 to the ID of an input so that they can be associated with one another.
Now there's an ID also for the input.
In plain HTML, you're probably used to using just for, but if you were to look under the hood at the underlying DOM element, it's really called HTML4. That's the JavaScript property for that element. Anyway, that's a digression. So now we have a checkbox that asks the person if they're friendly or not, and we want to maintain.
Okay. Oh, we learned a lot of things and I forgot to update this. I just forgot everything. Lol. What did we learn? Why can't I remember anything? I don't know.
Maintain this in state. Well, because it's a checkbox, we're not maintaining a string. So up in state, I'm going to add another piece of state and actually start separating these onto their own lines to save some space here. And we'll call it is friendly. And just to give them the benefit of the doubt, we'll call it true as the default. As I briefly mentioned, to associate our state is friendly with our checkbox, we're not going to use something like a value property, but instead we're going to use a checked property. Now, because a checkbox is either checked or unchecked, the value that we put in here for checked needs to be a boolean, or at least whatever you put in will be interpreted as a boolean. So if I put something truthy in like the string hi, it's going to check the box. If I put in something falsy like at least whatever you put in will be interpreted as a boolean. So if I put something truthy in like the string hi, it's going to check the box. If I put in something falsy like an empty string, it's going to not check the box. But in the end, that doesn't really matter because this should be a boolean value. So I'm going to say formally that is friendly. Now, when I hit refresh, do you think this checkbox will be checked or unchecked?
Checked.
should be checked because our default value is true. There. So when we say this box is checked, we are having React dictate to the box that it is checked, in fact, because that's what state is. Of course, now we've introduced a bit of a bug. I can't uncheck the box. Maybe that's a good thing for this specific form. We don't want people to be unfriendly. But for the sake of argument, let's say we want this to act like a normal form. If we look closely at our handle change function, we have only been looking at event.target.value. However, with a checkbox, we are not looking at the value property anymore. We're looking at a check property. So, of course, I could go out of my way to create a completely separate handle checkbox change function, but we can do better than that. Let's assume for now that we can reuse our same onChange function. We'll put in handle change as our onChange. And then let's go up to our handle change and we're going to make some modifications here. The first thing I want to talk about is a best practice that we should be following, and that is not to put the entire event.target.value and event.target.name down here inside of our set form data. At this point in the course, it's not that important that you understand why we're going to do this, but a much better way to handle this is to destructure event.target and pull out the values that we need. So we need name and value from event.target, and then I can switch this to name and switch this to value. And then, as I mentioned, when we're handling a checkbox, there's a few more things we need to pass in. One property that will come in is this type property on all of our inputs. We have a type text, email, and down here our type of checkbox. So let's bring in that type so we can check whether or not the input that's making this handle change function run is a type of checkbox. And if it is, we're also going to need the checked property. And this is either going to be true or false, depending on how the user has interacted with the checkbox. Now comes a bit of a trick. When I'm setting my maintenance.
Wait, what if there is no checked property? Then how would we destructure it from the event.target? Because this property will only be inside a checkbox and not these elements, but it is generalized. Why does this not produce any error in Java?
So let's bring in that type so we can check whether
Type is fine, but checked is not fine. Should not be fine.
or not the input that's making this handle change function run is a type of checkbox. And if it is, we're also going to need the checked property. And this is either going to be true or false, depending on how the user has interacted with the checkbox. Now comes a bit of a trick. When I'm setting my form data, I want everything else essentially to be the same. However, the piece of state that I want to update, if it's a checkbox, in our case, the isFriendly property, should not take on value, but rather should take on the value of check. So I can use a ternary here that says, is the type equal to checkbox? If so, I want you to use the checked property. But if not, I want you to use the value property.
Okay. So if there is okay, and if the type is not a checkbox, what will be the value inside of check?
Let me get rid of this console log because that's from a previous screencast. Let's refresh, look at the checkbox, and oh no, there's a bug. So I'd like you to look at the input that we've created, perhaps compare it to some of the past inputs that we've created, and see if you can figure out what we're missing.
Hmm. Are we missing something? Okay, we are missing name, I guess. Huh. Okay. Okay, name is friendly. Come on, bro. Let's go. Let's go.
Is in state. All of our other inputs have a name property, and that's something that I simply forgot to add in. So I'm going to add a name. This needs to match exactly what is in state. Say it's friendly, and that way, when I hit refresh, I should be able to now check the box. Awesome. This is probably a good time to mention that everything we're learning here with forms can be really confusing and especially hard to try to memorize. Honestly, as I've been preparing this lesson, I've had to go back to some of my old notes and some of my own recordings to remember what the syntax for this actually looks like. So just think of this as a pep talk. Now, if as I'm teaching it, you're still feeling totally lost and it's not making any sense at all, that's a cause for alarm. You should be able to generally follow along, but in this case, I'm not necessarily going to quiz you on the exact syntax for everything because, well, it's just as easy to look it up if you really need to. Okay, so let's get back on that course, and we're going to next look at radio buttons.
Oh no. Radio buttons. Hmm. Can I skip this, by the way?
In React, radio buttons are kind of an interesting combination of checkboxes and text inputs. I'll talk about what I mean in just a second, but in the meantime, I've put together this field set that asks about our current employment status. To skip some some of the mundane stuff. I've already added the type of radio and some IDs in order to associate the labels using HTML4 with the correct inputs. So now let's talk about mundane stuff. I've already added the type of radio and some IDs in order to associate the labels using HTML4 with the correct inputs. So now let's talk about how we can hook these radio buttons into our form and connect it with our state. First, we need a place in state to hold all of this information. I'll add another property to our state called employment, and where checkboxes are either true or false, radio buttons similar to inputs will have some kind of another property to our state called employment, and where checkboxes are either true or false, radio buttons similar to inputs will have some kind of text value to them. In this case, I want employment to be some kind of string, either unemployed, part-time, or full-time. So on a high-level overview, what will happen is when the user clicks one of these options, we will be watching for changes in these inputs, and when a change happens, it will take the value of that specific radio button that was clicked and set our state to that value. In order to associate my inputs with the correct piece of state, and also to make it so that I can't click all of my inputs the way I can now, I need to add a name property to each one of these inputs. Like we've done before, I'll set the name equal to employment, which
So a radio button is also multi-clickable. Then what's the point? If there can be multiple values that can be clicked, what's the point of radio button? I don't even get it. Isn't it just like checkbox? Yeah, so it should be a unique one, right? Because one cannot be unemployed and full time.
all of my inputs the way I can now, I need to add a name property to each one of these inputs. Like we've done before, I'll set the name equal to employment, which exactly matches the property that we are saving in state. The reason we're giving the same name to all three of these radio buttons is, first of all, in HTML, that's the way that we make it so only one of these radio buttons.
Wow. So if we give the same name to three buttons, then only one of them can get clicked. Why is that? Like, why? How can we? There should be some other way, right? This is like, okay, never mind.
Can be selected at any given time, but it also intuitively makes sense because we're only updating one property of employment based on which one is selected. Each one of these inputs will have its own unique value, and this value is what will actually get saved as the value in state when this specific input is selected. So for the unemployment or the unemployed one, I'll put unemployed, my on change of handle change. Believe it or not, we'll also be able to use the same handle change function, and we'll see why in just a minute. And
How?
technically speaking, this should now be hooked up correctly to state. I can test that by coming up here and console logging my state. We'll just console log the employment part of it. So I say console log form data employment. We hit refresh, we get an empty string, and then when we choose unemployed, it switches to unemployed, part-time, and full-time. There's one more small thing that we need to change, and it's essentially mirroring what we did when we were setting our value equal to the state. Radio buttons are a little different because we need to specify what value the state should take on if the radio button is selected or checked. However, that means that we can't do controlled components in the same way that we did with our inputs by setting the value equal to whatever the current value of state is. But that doesn't mean we can't control these components. It's just that radio buttons are controlled in the same way that checkboxes are controlled. Here we were able to say checked equals formData.isFriendly. However, if we try to do the exact same thing with our radio buttons, we're going to run into a little bug. We'll see that here. I'll say checked equals formData.employment. And when I click one of them, well, some weird stuff is happening. This is where radio buttons differ from checkboxes in that when we are controlling the check property, we don't simply say check equals formData.employment because, unlike a checkbox, this is not a Boolean value, but we can make it a Boolean value by checking if the formData.employment is equal to the value of this specific checkbox. So I'll do the exact.
Makes sense, right? Makes sense. But it's just too much code for a simple MCQ question.
Same thing over here. And now React is in charge of controlling this
Why can't we just give a number 1, 2, and 3?
input rather than the input having its own HTML state. Let me go here. And now React is in charge of controlling this input rather than the input having its own HTML state. Let me walk through that one more time. Let me hit refresh. Initially, the value of stormdata.employment is an empty string. When I click unemployed, it runs the onChange for handle change, which we have defined here. We're pulling the name, value type, and check out. We're setting the form data. We're bringing in all the old form data. Now we're using name, which we had set to employment, as the key for our state that we're updating. And it looks here, says, is the type checkbox? In reality, no, this is not a checkbox, it's a radio. So it skips the checked value and instead uses this value. This value is the value that we defined here, where we said it's either unemployed, part-time, or full-time. Then when we change state, React re-renders our form. It checks to see if the current form data.employment is equal to unemployed. In our case, since that's the one we chose, then that becomes a true statement, and therefore checked is true, and all of these other checks are false. That makes it so that only one of these can be checked at any given time. In my opinion, radio buttons are probably the most confusing element to deal with in React. So if you have understood everything we just walked through, then kudos to you. Truly, this is a big accomplishment. So you really should be proud of yourself. Again, you don't need to have memorized this necessarily. You can always go back to this lesson or find something from people to help you through the syntax of this if you need it again in the future. But if you were able to follow along with the logic that we just talked through, then that really is a good signal that you understand state, you understand event handlers, and some of these little quirks about forms in general. There's one more form element I want to talk about before we move on, and that is select boxes, and we'll do that in the next screencast.
Select boxes. Hmm. Please stop, please stop, please stop. Ah,
The last
I'm not entirely sure if I know radio buttons. Huh. Where is the radio? Yeah, this is the radio. Okay, let's just go. Okay, let's just write it down. All of the weird things we got. So, radio. Okay, we can do later. Let's just finish this first. We can watch this video again, right?
form element we're going to talk about in React is the select box with its options. In regular HTML, it's usually set up something like this, where you have the select box. I've added an ID just so we can associate our label with it, and it has a number of options. HTML, it's the last form element we're going to talk about in React is the select box with its options. In regular HTML,
Select box with its options.
it's usually set up something like this, where you have the select box. I've added an ID just so we can associate our label with it, and it has a number of options inside with a value for each.
Where is it from? Where is it? Okay, so here is it.
Its options. In regular HTML, it's usually set up something like this, where you have the select box. I've added an ID just so we can associate our label with it, and it has a number of options inside with a value for each option. In regular HTML, in order to grab the value of whichever one is selected, you will look for a property called selected, although that would happen in the JavaScript. But all of this is a bit beside the point because React has decided to make it a lot more similar to regular HTML. In order to grab the value of whichever one is selected, you will look for a property called selected, although that would happen in the JavaScript. But all of this is a bit beside the point because React has decided to make it a lot more similar to some of the other input elements that we have seen so far. So just like we've done with some of the other elements, we are going to add a value property here on the select itself. And this value, similar to our text inputs, will just mirror what we have in state. Now currently we're not saving a favorite color in state. They're on the select itself. And this value, similar to our text inputs, will just mirror what we have in state. Now currently we're not saving a favorite color in state. So let's go ahead and add a color. We'll start it off as an empty string. And then down here in our select, we will say form data.
Wait, why did he give it the ID of favorite color? What's the use of that? First of all, okay, maybe just for the label, so that when we click this, uh-huh, okay, now, so that when we click this, this should actually point us to this. Okay, fine.
Some other input elements that we have seen so far. So just like we've done with some of the other elements, we are going to add a value property here on the select itself. And this value, similar to our text.
So the value property is used to get the value of this from the state in React instead of you choosing it directly, so that there remains a single source of truth.
Inputs will just mirror what we have in state. Now currently we're not saving a favorite color in state, so let's go ahead and add a color. We'll start it off as an empty string, and then down here in our select we will say form data dot save color. We can reuse the same onChange handler that we've been using with handle change.
Form change handler. Of course.
And in order for handle change to work correctly, we need to make sure that we mirror our name to exactly equal the property that we're saving in state. So at this point, I should be able to click my drop down, and you won't see this drop down in the recording, but if you click onto this apple with the refresh icon, you can test this out for yourself. I'll click the drop down, and I see the different colors.
Why can't we see it in the recording, by the way? Is it too... I don't know. We can't even see when he does a new file. Weird. Please include that feature, Scrimba.
There's red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. I can choose green, and that will change our drop down to green. And actually, let's go up here and change form data employment to console log our favorite color instead. So that way, whenever I make a choice, green, our state is updated according to the value of the option that was chosen in the stop box. Now we do have one little issue here. If I hit refresh, we see that I'm initializing state as an empty string for the favorite color, but currently I don't have an option that represents the empty string value. One way I can see that our state is up to change form data employment to console log our favorite color instead. I can choose green, and that will change our drop down to green. And actually, let's go up here and change form data to the value of the option console log our favorite color instead. So that way, whenever I make a choice like green, our state is updating according to the value of the option that was chosen in the starting box. Now we
Okay, so the state is updating by whatever the value was there. Okay.
do have one little issue here. If I hit refresh, we see that I'm initializing state as an empty string for the
So they are taking from the state, and the state is taking from the value. Ah,
value of the option that was console log our favorite color instead. So that way, whenever I make a choice like green, our state is updating according to the value of the option that was chosen in this drop-down box. Now we do have one little issue here. If I hit refresh, we see that I'm initializing state as an empty string for the favorite color, but currently I don't have an option that represents the empty string value. One way I can change this is by providing a new option where the value is an empty string, and then maybe I put in something like choose that makes it so that the user will see choose here on the first option. We'll hit refresh, we see choose as our option, but I can still drop this down and change it to any of these other colors, just like we would expect. And that pretty much does it for any of the form elements that we're going to be talking about in this course. There's one last small thing we need to cover about forms, which is how to submit a form, and so that's what we'll cover in the next lesson.
what's the other way? We can actually set the state to be red, maybe. Huh. Yeah, I think.
Now that we have a way to gather all of this information from our user, we need to be able to submit the form. In HTML, you might be familiar with an input of type submit. An input type submit is, well, basically just a button. And of course, the default option there is submit. We can change the value to something different, like, I don't know, send it in or something. Okay, and that changes the text of the button. Let me put a couple breaks here just to move that down a bit.
Wow.
However, in HTML5, they made it so that the actual button element, if it's found inside of a form, acts like a submit button. What's nice about the button element inside the form is that you're not doing this weird value thing because it's not really a value, it's just the text of the button. So I could just put submit here, and because this button is found inside of a form element, its type is actually automatically submit by default. In fact, if you didn't want it to act like a submit button, we'd have to actually change the type of the button, which looks kind of funny, button by button. So let's just make use of that default. We'll get rid of our, in fact, if you didn't want it here, and because this button is found inside of a form element, its type is actually automatically submit by default. In fact, if you didn't want it to act like a submit button, we'd have to actually change the type to button, which looks kind of funny, button by button. So let's just make use of that default. We'll get rid of our type completely, and therefore the default is type submit. And clicking this button, because the button is found inside of a form, will actually trigger the form's on submit event handler.
Okay, so any button found inside a form is by default a type submit. If you want to change this, change the type of button to button. Okay, and you can also do this submission by what? Input. Input or what? Input type submit, right? Input type equals submit and value. This will also work. Right?
HTML5 found inside of was found inside of a form will actually trigger the form's on submit
Uh-huh.
event handler. Now, back in the day, instead of having a JavaScript on submit handler, you might have something like a method that tells you this is going.
Will trigger forms on submit.
Going to be a post request,
Sorry.
and you'd have an action that probably led to some PHP file.php, and then PHP would take the data and process it, do whatever you needed to do. However, we're going to essentially bypass that entire system. We're going to set up the onSubmit event handler, and let's create a function called handleSubmit. And up here, I'll actually create that function. And what's nice about the way we have set up our form in React is now, instead of having to go through every one of our inputs and gather the values right at the last second before we submit this to maybe an API, we've been doing all that work all along as we've been
Handle
updating the
change.
state on every change of the inputs and elements in our form.
Exactly.
So if we pretended that we had some kind of submit to API function, we would really just be able to probably pass our form data object into that function because it's already updated. It's been updated after every change in the form. Now, just like in vanilla JavaScript, if you have built a form and gathered the data in JavaScript, you know that clicking the submit button will actually refresh this page and it'll put all of the form values as part of a query string in the form and gather the data in JavaScript. You know that clicking the submit button will actually refresh this page and it'll put all of the form values as part of a query string in the URL. That all harkens back to the original way that forms were submitted with an action property. So the first thing we will always want to do in React when we're handling a form submit is to take that event object that will get passed to this
Prevent
handler
default.
and run event.prevent default. Preventing the default means that it won't refresh our page and essentially re-render our app with all of these default values in state. Prevent default just stops all of that from happening and makes it so that we can then run code the way that we actually want to. Just to see this working, I don't actually have a function called submit to API, so let's just console log our form data. So before we test this out, let me remove some of these console logs so we can actually see what we're working with. I'll hit refresh, type in some generic values here, okay, and we'll hit submit, and we can see we got our state object. Everything has been automatically updating as we've been typing things into our form. And maybe just to drive the point home, let me comment out this prevent default, and I'll type in some stuff here and hit submit. You can see my form refresh, and then my URL actually updated. And I'll type in some stuff here and hit submit. You can see my form refresh and then my URL actually updated. I'm not sure if that comes through in the recording, but this is the URL and it's in all of my values based on the name properties, vector as query strings in the URL, and it's just not what we wanted. Okay, with all of that behind us, I do want to get your hands on the keyboard practicing some of the things we've learned with forms, so that will be what we do in our upcoming challenge.
One thing I'm really curious about that when we submit, we need the page to change, right? How will we do that? Because if we have already filled the things, then we actually want the page to change. Uh-huh.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground, so before we move on, I want to test your skills and your knowledge, make sure you were paying attention. So with this quiz, pause the screencast, click into the editor, type down your answers, and when you've answered all the questions, click play, and we'll go over the quiz together. All of it. Usually you listen in a submit event, and then you'll go to each one of the elements in the form and gather the data. So in number 2, it asks basically how is that different in a React app. So it's after all the data, for example, the value, name, on change, etc., should match so that we know which property and state for that to update whenever next. In all the other form elements, we're using the value property to know how we should update our state, but with a checkbox, we're looking specifically for the checked property. Okay, and number 5, how do you watch know what's different about saving the data property in select element versus other form elements? Number 4, page to help us in our on chain match the property name being held in state for that input. Well, it's the name property. Essentially, we use that main property to help us in our onChange so that we know which property in state to update whenever a change happens. Number 4, oh, but A should not be there. What's different about saving the data from a checkbox element versus other form elements? In all the other form elements, we're using the value property to know how we should update our state, but with the checkbox, we're looking specifically for the checked property. Okay, and number 5, how do you watch for a form submit and how can you trigger a form submit? Simply enough, we can add an onSubmit handler on the form element. That's how we can watch for a form submit, and we will pass a function to the onSubmit handler that will run whenever the form is submitted. So then how do you trigger a form submit? Usually that will happen with some sort of button click. As a quick reminder, in the markup, if you have a button element that's inside of a form, it will automatically act as a submit button for that form. Alternatively, and what kind of seems like the older way to me, is to use an input type submit. But to me, there's not really a benefit to doing that. Okay, awesome job on this quiz. The way to me is to use an input type submit. But to me, there's not really a benefit to doing that. Okay, awesome job on this quiz. Hopefully you were able to answer all these questions. Next, we're going to put what we've learned about forms into practice. In this challenge, your job is to connect our existing form to some local state and update that state whenever the user interacts with the form. As we've been doing, I want you to make sure that you only create a single handle change existing form to some local state and update that state whenever the user interacts with the form. As we've been doing,
Let's do this in the next live stream. Probably after some minutes.